A sign at platform 3. That's where it all began. On a Tuesday afternoon at one of the busiest railway stations in the city, a 9-year-old girl stood alone in the middle of hundreds of rushing strangers, holding a hand-written cardboard sign that said 5 words, "Dog for sale, urgent." Nobody stopped. Nobody asked why. They all walked past her like she was invisible. But what that little girl was selling wasn't just a dog. She was trying to sell the only living thing that had ever held her together when her world was falling apart. His name was Rex, a German shepherd who had slept on hospital floors beside her, who had pressed against her chest when she couldn't breathe, who had been her only company on the nights nobody came. And the reason she was selling him. Her mother had cancer, the surgery was in 48 hours, and the hospital had told her the money had to come first. No payment, no operation. She was 9 years old, completely alone, and she had run out of every other option. Here is what nobody knew yet. The same hospital demanding that money had been stealing from families like hers for years. Not one family, not 10, 47 families had been robbed of their right to survive, all while a man in a leather jacket sat on the board controlling every decision. And the most shocking part, that man had walked up to Emma on platform 3 that same afternoon, looked at Rex, and offered her cash on the spot, right there at the scene of his own crime, without her knowing who he was. What happened in the next 30 days would expose a corruption network that ran from a railway platform straight into the offices of the people who were supposed to save lives. Stay with us. This story doesn't just end with justice. It ends with something nobody saw coming. Stay with us because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Platform 3 of Central City Station was never truly quiet, not even on a slow afternoon. The screech of train brakes tore through the air every few minutes, and the loudspeaker above Emma's head crackled with muffled announcements about delays and departing platforms. People moved in every direction around her, businessmen dragging suitcases, mothers wrestling strollers, teenagers laughing into their phones. The air smelled of diesel and fried food from the station kiosk, and the floor vibrated faintly each time a heavy train rolled in. Emma stood in the middle of all of it, holding her cardboard sign in both hands, and not a single person stopped. Not one. She was surrounded by hundreds of people and had never felt more alone in her life. Beside her sat Rex, a large German shepherd with a thick amber coat and calm, watchful eyes. He wasn't straining at his leash or barking at the strangers flowing past him. He simply sat at Emma's feet with the quiet steadiness of something ancient and loyal, his warm flank pressed gently against her leg. To anyone passing by, he was just a dog. But Emma knew better. Rex had been there on the worst nights, when her mother's breathing turned shallow and the machines in the hospital room beeped too fast. He would lay his heavy head across her lap without being asked, as if he could feel the panic rising in her chest before she could name it herself. He had slept on the floor beside every hospital bed, every waiting room chair, every night Emma had spent curled under a thin blanket, not knowing if morning would bring good news or the worst kind. He wasn't a pet. He was the reason she had not completely fallen apart. Her mother's name was Claire, and 3 days ago the doctors had used words Emma had to look up on the cracked screen of her mother's old phone. Stage 3, aggressive. The surgery was scheduled, but the hospital had been clear about one thing first. There was an advance payment required, a number so large it looked unreal when Emma wrote it on a scrap of paper. They had no insurance. The small savings her mother had kept in a jar above the kitchen sink would not come close. Emma had spent an entire evening calling the number on a pamphlet she'd found in the hospital lobby, a local NGO that helped families in medical crisis. The woman on the phone had been polite. She had used words like limited resources and waitlist, and will do our best. By the time Emma hung up, she understood that polite was not the same as helpful. The NGO would not be coming. That night, Emma had sat on the kitchen floor with Rex's head in her lap, her fingers moving slowly through his fur while her mind turned over every option she could think of. She was 9 years old. She had no money, no relatives nearby, and no plan. At some point, the thought arrived quietly, the way the worst thoughts always do. Rex was the only thing she had that someone else might want. She had not cried when she wrote the sign. She had only whispered into the warm curve of his neck, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." He had pressed closer, and that had made it harder. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked steadily through the silence, counting down the 48 hours the hospital had given them before the surgery slot would be offered to another patient. Emma did not sleep that night. By morning, she had made her decision. By afternoon, she was standing on platform 3 with a cardboard sign and a heart that felt like it had already broken into more pieces than she could count. The man arrived within the first hour. He was heavy-set, with thick fingers, and a leather jacket that creaked when he moved. He looked Rex up and down the way someone examines machinery, checking the shoulders, the jaw, the alert posture of his ears. "How much?" he asked, without looking at Emma at all. She told him the number she needed, and he laughed through his nose. "I'll give you half," he said, pulling folded bills from his jacket and fanning them out. "Cash. Right now. No paperwork." Rex sat perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking the man without blinking. Emma looked at the money, then at Rex, then at the money again. Her fingers found the leash and held it so tightly the nylon edge bit into her palm. She was close, terrifyingly close to simply handing it over and being done with the worst moment of her life. Her arm extended just slightly, the leash shifting in her grip, the man reaching forward. Then something stopped her. Not a sound, not a word, just the quiet pressure of Rex leaning his weight against her leg, as he always had, the same way he did beside every hospital bed. Her breath came out in a shudder, and she pulled the leash back. The man frowned and walked away, muttering something she didn't try to hear. It was another 20 minutes before anyone else stopped. This time it was a woman in a dark coat, mid-30s, with a press lanyard hanging around her neck and a small notebook tucked under her arm. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was a journalist for the city's largest daily paper. She had been crossing to platform 5 when something in Emma's posture made her slow down. Not the sign, the posture. The way a child's shoulders can carry a grief that belongs to adults. Sarah approached quietly and crouched until she was level with Emma's eyes. "Are you selling him?" she asked, her voice even and careful. "Or are you asking for help?" Emma opened her mouth to say she was selling him. That was the plan. That was the only plan she had. But the question landed somewhere it was not supposed to, and instead of words, what came out was a sound, a small, broken sound that a 9-year-old should never have to make in public. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, but it was too late. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sat down hard on her cardboard sign right there on the platform floor, and then she was crying in the way that people cry when they have been holding it for days and something simply gives way. Sarah sat beside her. She did not immediately reach for her phone or her notebook. She just sat there on the dirty platform floor, while Emma cried and Rex pressed his nose against Emma's cheek, and the trains continued to screech and the loudspeaker continued to crackle above their heads. After a few minutes, Emma told her everything: the hospital, the deadline, the NGO, the sign, the man with the leather jacket. Sarah listened without interrupting. When Emma finished, Sarah reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and asked quietly, "Can I tell your story?" Emma wiped her face with her sleeve and looked at Rex. He held her gaze steadily. "Yes," she said. "Tell it." Sarah filmed a short video right there on platform 3, Emma sitting on the floor, Rex beside her, the cardboard sign still in her lap. She uploaded it with a single line of caption and her article link. Within 3 hours the hashtag was trending in 2 cities. Within 6, donations had begun to exceed the hospital's required advance. By evening, the hospital administrator called Sarah directly. His voice was professional and measured, but the offer underneath it was less so. If Sarah agreed to quietly close her coverage, the hospital would unlock an internal fund and waive the advance payment entirely. Sarah wrote down every word he said, thanked him politely, and hung up. She looked at Emma across the small cafe table where they had taken shelter from the platform noise. "They want me to stop," she said simply. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea, Rex lying across her feet under the table. Then she looked up. "Don't," she said. It was one word, but it carried the full weight of everything the last 48 hours had cost her. Sarah nodded once, opened her laptop, and kept writing. Sarah's exposé ran the following morning on the front page and the digital edition both. The headline was calm and precise, but the content was not. The investigation had uncovered a pattern the hospital had been running for years. Vulnerable families routed away from emergency aid funds, those funds quietly redirected into administrative accounts, and a network of mid-level staff who kept the whole arrangement quiet in exchange for small bonuses. The evidence was documented, the sources named, the paper trail clear. By midday, the city health authority had launched a formal inquiry. By late afternoon, 2 senior hospital administrators had been placed on suspension pending investigation. News vans parked outside the hospital entrance, and social media lit up with people sharing the article and tagging local officials. It looked, from the outside, like a clean and satisfying victory. Inside the hospital in a room on the 4th floor, it did not feel that way. The government emergency fund had been approved within hours of the inquiry announcement. Pressure from above had apparently moved things very quickly once cameras were involved. The surgery was confirmed for the following morning. Emma should have felt relief settling like warmth through her chest. Instead, she sat in the plastic chair beside her mother's bed while a doctor explained, in the calm and careful tone that doctors use when they are delivering news they have delivered before, that the cancer had spread further than the previous scans had indicated. The original treatment plan would need to be revised. The surgery remained necessary, but the road after it would be longer and harder than they had hoped. Emma listened to every word. She nodded at the right moments. She asked the one question she needed to ask, and the doctor answered it with measured honesty rather than false comfort. When he left the room, the silence that followed was very loud. A nurse arrived a few minutes later with a clipboard and a consent form for the surgery. It was several pages long and printed in small type. Emma looked at the form, then at her mother, who was pale against the pillow and barely strong enough to hold a pen. Claire looked back at her daughter, and something passed between them that neither of them could have named. "I'll sign it," Emma said quietly. The nurse hesitated, glancing between the child and the patient. Claire nodded once, slowly, and the nurse placed the clipboard in Emma's hands without another word. Emma's fingers wrapped around the pen. It trembled slightly as she pressed it to the line at the bottom of the page. She was 9 years old. The pen felt enormous. Across the room, Rex paced the narrow strip of floor between the window and the door, his nails clicking softly against the tile, his head low, his eyes moving from Emma to Claire and back again. He felt it too. Staff had let him in without comment. Nobody had said a word about the hospital's pet policy since Sarah's article had run. One nurse passing in the hallway murmured something to a colleague, and Emma caught only a fragment of it. "Father came by this morning," the voice said low and quick. "Saw the news. Left before anyone could speak to him." Emma heard it. She gave no visible reaction. She finished signing the form, handed the clipboard back, and sat down beside her mother's bed. She took Claire's hand in both of hers and held it carefully, as though it were something fragile she had only just realized she might lose. Outside the room, the corridor hummed with the ordinary sounds of a hospital at work, but inside, the weight of what those few words had carried pressed down on Emma's chest like something cold and heavy, not grief exactly, but something close to it. Trust, she was beginning to understand, could break in more than one direction at once. Claire's surgery was scheduled for 7 in the morning, and by 6 the corridor outside her room had grown quiet in that particular way hospitals do before something important, a hush that felt less like calm and more like held breath. Emma sat on the edge of her mother's bed, close enough that their shoulders touched. Claire had been awake since before dawn, and her hand rested over Emma's with a grip that was gentle but deliberate. "Whatever happens," Claire said, her voice low but steady, "Rex stays with you." "Promise me that," Emma nodded. Rex lay beside the bed on the tiled floor, his chin flat against his paws, his eyes open and watching. He had not left the room since the night before. A nurse had quietly brought in a folded blanket for him at some point after midnight, placing it near the radiator without comment, and he had barely moved from that spot. Emma had overheard 2 nurses discussing the blood bank shortage 2 days earlier, and the information had settled in her mind the way important things do when you are young and have learned to pay close attention to adult conversations. She had asked Sarah about it that morning in the hospital cafeteria, speaking quickly and clearly in the way she did when she had already decided something and only needed the words confirmed. Sarah had listened, set her coffee down, and picked up her phone without hesitation. The appeal went out through Sarah's verified accounts first, then through 3 local news outlets who had been following the story, then through the network of people who had already donated after Platform 3. By noon, the line outside the hospital blood donation unit stretched past the front entrance and curved along the pavement toward the car park. Hospital staff stood at the door looking slightly overwhelmed. A volunteer coordinator from a neighboring charity arrived uninvited and began managing the queue with a clipboard and a calm authority that nobody questioned. Emma stood near the window on the 4th floor and looked down at the line below. She had not expected this. She had known people were watching the story, had known from the donation numbers that strangers were paying attention, but seeing them standing there in the ordinary afternoon light, a wide woman in a yellow coat, an elderly man with a walking stick, a group of young people who had clearly come together, made something tighten and then release in her chest in a way she couldn't quite explain. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. Rex appeared silently at her side, rising from the corner of the room to stand close, his warmth solid and familiar against her leg. The man who pushed through the hospital's front entrance just after 2 o'clock was not standing in the donation line. He moved too quickly for that, with the uneven, hesitant gait of someone who had decided to do something difficult and was afraid that slowing down would cause him to stop. He was tall, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept in some time. A nurse at the reception desk recognized him from the morning visit and directed him upstairs. Sarah was in the corridor near Claire's room when he stepped off the elevator. She recognized him from the photograph Emma had once shown her without meaning to linger on it. She said nothing, only watched as he walked to the room door and stopped with his hand flat against it, not quite pushing it open. Emma turned when the door moved. She looked at him for a long moment in which neither of them spoke. His face carried the collapsed, hollowed look of a man who had spent a long time running and had finally run out of road. "I saw the news," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "I should have come sooner." Emma looked at him the way a child looks at something they are still deciding how to feel about. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She did not close the door, but she did not move closer either. Rex sat at her heel and fixed the man with an expression that was not hostile but was unmistakably watchful, as if reserving final judgment. Down the corridor, the intercom announced that the surgical team was ready. The moment was over before it had fully begun. The surgery could not wait. The surgical team delivered their update at 11 that evening. Claire was stable. The procedure had gone as well as they could have hoped, and the recovery would be slow, but the prognosis was better than the revised scans had suggested. Emma sat in the waiting area, with Rex at her feet and Sarah beside her and her father in a chair across the room when the surgeon came out. She exhaled a breath that felt like it had been held for days. The tension drained from her shoulders so fast she felt briefly dizzy, and Rex pressed his nose against her knee, as if he had been measuring the stress in her body and was relieved to feel it go. Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand once quickly, without making it a moment. Emma nodded and looked across at her father. He met her eyes. Neither of them smiled, but something in the air between them shifted fractionally, like a window cracked open. The relief lasted less than 36 hours. Sarah arrived at the hospital the following afternoon with her laptop already open, her jaw set in a way Emma had learned to read. She sat beside Emma in the corridor and explained it without softening the edges. The government emergency fund that had been approved so quickly after the inquiry announcement had not been released. There was a bureaucratic hold, paperwork filed incorrectly, review committee not yet convened, standard procedure, entirely normal, nothing to worry about. Sarah's source inside the health authority told her something different. The hold was deliberate. Someone with enough influence inside the fund's approval chain was slowing the process, and the delay was not an accident. Sarah had already begun pulling records and cross-referencing names. The answer surfaced within 12 hours of digging, and when it did, it hit Sarah with the particular cold clarity of something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The chairman of the hospital's private management board, the man who ultimately controlled the internal fund and had been among the administrators placed under inquiry review, was the same man who had appeared on Platform 3 on the afternoon Emma held her sign. The heavy-set man in the leather jacket who had fanned out cash and offered her half the number she needed. The man whose offer Rex had silently refused by pressing against Emma's leg at precisely the right moment. He had not been passing through the station by chance. His company had a property interest adjacent to the hospital, and his presence on the board was not disclosed in any public document. The fund delay was his mechanism for applying quiet pressure, a way to signal to authorities that cooperation had a price, and that price was the investigation going away. Sarah sat with her notes spread across the small table in the hospital corridor and felt the shape of it settle into something solid and prosecutable. She made 3 phone calls in quick succession: her editor, a contact at the city prosecutor's office, and a financial journalist at a national outlet who had been sniffing around the hospital's accounts for 6 months and had run out of leads. Within 2 hours, the national journalist had confirmed the board chairman's name against his own independent records. Within 4, the story had moved beyond Sarah's single outlet and into a network of coverage that was considerably harder to suppress. Public reaction was not slow in coming. The comments section of every article carrying the chairman's name filled with fury, not the performative kind that fades in a news cycle, but the kind that comes from people who have dealt with institutional indifference at their most vulnerable and recognize what they are looking at. A local politician quoted Sarah's reporting in a formal parliamentary inquiry question. A patient advocacy organization announced it was filing its own complaint with the National Health Regulator. The fund delay became, almost overnight, the most visible symbol of exactly the kind of cruelty the original exposé had documented. The chairman's legal team issued a statement describing the allegations as unfounded and politically motivated. Nobody found the statement particularly persuasive. The inquiry that had begun as a review of administrative misconduct quietly expanded its scope to include the board's financial dealings. Emma learned all of this in fragments, from Sarah's updates and overheard phone calls and brief news clips that played on the television mounted in the corridor near her mother's room. She processed each piece the way she had processed everything in the past week, quietly, with Rex beside her and her mother's slow, steady breathing through the open door as the sound that mattered most. Justice, she was discovering, did not arrive cleanly. It came in pieces, and some of the pieces left marks. Sarah had been a journalist for 11 years, and she understood the difference between powerful people who were embarrassed and powerful people who were frightened. The chairman, being embarrassed, had produced a press statement. The chairman, being frightened, produced something else entirely. The call arrived on Sarah's personal mobile just after 9 on a Tuesday night, 2 days after the national story broke. The voice was male and unhurried. The tone conversational in the way that threats sometimes are when they come from people who are accustomed to being taken seriously. "You have a child in that story," the voice said. "Children are fragile. Accidents happen in cities." Sarah kept her voice flat and even. "Is that a statement or a warning?" There was a short pause, then a click, and the line went dead. She sat for a moment in her car outside the hospital with her phone still in her hand, the screen dimming in the silence, and then she rang her editor and read the call back from memory, word for word. The following morning Sarah drove to the hospital in a car that a colleague had lent her. Her own vehicle was in the police impound lot, being examined. A mechanic friend of a fellow journalist had spotted the problem first: a partially severed brake line, clean and precise, not the kind of damage that happens from road wear. The police officer who took the complaint at the front desk was professionally attentive. He filed the report without dramatic reaction, asked Sarah to confirm whether she had received any prior communication suggesting a threat, and wrote down what she told him. She walked out of the station feeling the particular cold alertness that comes from understanding that a situation has changed category. She had reported on corruption before. She had received angry emails and one or two vague social media messages. She had not, before now, had a brake line cut. The city felt different as she walked back to the borrowed car. Emma knew something had happened before Sarah told her directly. She noticed it in the way Sarah moved through the hospital corridor that morning, slightly more deliberate than usual, her eyes doing a small automatic sweep of exits and windows that Emma had not observed before. Emma had spent enough time around adults who were managing fear to recognize the signs. "Someone hurt your car," Emma said, when Sarah sat beside her. It was not quite a question. Sarah looked at her for a moment, seemed to calculate something, and then nodded once. "They're trying to scare me," she said. "Has it worked?" Emma asked. Sarah looked at her steadily. "No," she said, "but it means I need to be more careful, and so do you." Rex had been watching Sarah since she arrived, and at the word careful he raised his head and shifted his weight forward in the way he did when his attention had been fully engaged. Emma placed her hand on his back, feeling the solid warmth of him, the deep, slow rhythm of his breathing. Sarah had a habit of talking through what she was thinking when she was in the process of deciding something, and that evening she talked for a long time, not about the story specifically, but about what it meant to stay with a truth when the staying became costly. Emma listened without interrupting, in the way she always listened, with her full attention and her hands quiet in her lap. "My editor says I should step back," Sarah said at one point, more to herself than to Emma. "Hand it to the national team. Let them carry it." She paused. "But I was on that platform. I sat on that floor with you." Emma looked up at her. "I know," she said simply. There was nothing more that needed to be added. The two of them sat in the corridor for another hour, Rex warm between them, the hospital humming its ordinary sounds around them, while the city outside made decisions that were slowly closing in. The hospital car park was half empty by 10 o'clock on Thursday night. A weak overhead light buzzed at the far end near the stairwell, and the spaces closest to the entrance were taken by staff vehicles parked in a row. Sarah had stayed late reviewing documents with a legal contact who had agreed to meet her informally in the hospital cafeteria, a financial consultant who had worked previously with the health authority and who had agreed, after 2 days of careful persuasion, to provide background context for the expanded investigation. They had sat for 3 hours at a corner table with Sarah's laptop open and a stack of printed records between them. The consultant had left through the main entrance at 9:40. Sarah gathered her papers, packed her bag, and took the side exit to the car park because it was closer to where the borrowed vehicle was parked. She noticed them when she was halfway across the lot. 2 figures, dark jackets, no identifiable features. They were standing near the car, not quite close enough to have touched it yet, but positioned with the particular deliberateness of people who are waiting for something specific to arrive. Sarah stopped walking. Her hand went to her bag, muscle memory reaching for her phone. One of the men moved toward her with a directness that left no doubt about intention. "The laptop," he said. Not her bag, not her phone. The laptop. They knew what they had come for, and they had come for the documents. She clutched the strap of her bag against her shoulder and stepped back, gauging the distance to the stairwell door. The second man moved to flank her, cutting off the angle. For a single, sharp-edged second, the car park was perfectly still. Rex came around the front of the car without a sound. He had been there the entire time. Emma had insisted he accompany Sarah that evening with the certainty of a child who has learned to trust an instinct she cannot fully articulate, and Sarah had agreed. He had been lying flat in the back seat with the window cracked, invisible from outside. He did not bark. He moved at full speed from the car toward the nearest man in a straight line, and the impact was significant. The man went down hard against the bonnet of the adjacent car, the sound of it sharp and loud in the empty lot. Rex did not bite. He pressed. He blocked. He used his weight with a precision that looked almost trained. The second man ran. Not a measured retreat, an immediate flight, stumbling on the speed bump at the exit before disappearing into the dark of the street beyond. Within 90 seconds the car park held only Sarah, Rex, and the man pinned against the car by 100 pounds of calm German shepherd who had clearly decided that moving was not a good idea. Sarah called the police with steady hands and her voice at its most professional, watching Rex hold his position without relaxation, his eyes tracking every movement of the man on the ground. Security arrived from the hospital entrance within 4 minutes and found her standing with her arms folded and her bag still on her shoulder, entirely intact, while the dog looked up at the uniform and then at Sarah as if asking whether his work was complete. A security guard stared at Rex for a long moment. "Eyes he trained?" he asked. "I genuinely don't know," Sarah said. She crouched when she said it, and Rex turned and pressed his forehead against her knee in the quiet, firm way he had pressed against Emma's leg on platform 3. The documents were untouched. The laptop was in her bag. The men had come for the truth, and Rex had decided it was not theirs to take. Later, in the hospital corridor, Emma listened to Sarah recount what had happened with Rex sitting between them and his tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps across the floor. When Sarah finished, Emma looked at him for a long time without speaking. "He always knows," she said quietly. It was not a question. It was something she had understood for a long time already. School had been inconsistent for Emma in recent weeks. Some mornings she went, moving through classrooms with the contained, slightly distant manner of a child whose mind is occupied with larger things than the curriculum. Her teacher had spoken to a school counselor, who had spoken to Sarah, who had explained the situation in broad terms while leaving the more dangerous details unspoken. The school had been quietly accommodating. Nobody had pressed Emma about missed homework or noted absences formally. On the Thursday afternoon, 2 days after the car park incident, Emma was collected from the school entrance at 3:15 by the same route she always took, Rex walking at her heel on a short lead. It was a 15-minute walk to the bus stop, through a residential street lined with parked cars and a row of shuttered shops. The man was waiting near the post box at the corner of Elm Road, and he had the particular professional stillness of someone who has planned for the next 2 minutes specifically. He crouched to Emma's height when she drew level with him, the way adults do when they want to seem approachable, and he told her he was a friend of her father's, that her father had sent him, that there was an important message, and could she come with him for just a moment. His voice was smooth and careful. Emma looked at him without moving. Rex had not moved either, but his body had changed. The relaxed, pacing quality was entirely gone, replaced by a rigidity that was visible from the shoulder blades down, every muscle held in a state of readiness that a 9-year-old girl standing beside him could feel through the leash as clearly as a current. The man extended his hand toward Emma's shoulder. The van parked on the far side of the road had its sliding door already partially open. Rex moved between them before the man's hand completed its reach. Not an attack, a placement deliberate and immovable, his entire body as a barrier, his stance making absolutely clear that the space between his shoulder and Emma's leg was not available to anyone who had not been invited into it. He gave one bark, low, resonant, the kind that carries across a street and into open windows. The man straightened and stepped back. A curtain moved in the bay window of the house nearest the corner. A woman on the opposite pavement stopped walking. The van door pulled shut and the engine started. Emma had not moved. Her hand on Rex's leash was completely still. The van drove away and Emma watched it go, memorizing the partial number plate with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that small details matter. She brought Rex to the curb, sat down on it, and called Sarah. The police response was immediate in the way that responses become immediate when journalists and formal complaints are already involved. Emma gave the partial plate, described the man in careful detail, and answered every question the officer asked in the same clear, direct manner she used for everything. She was shaken, not in the way that shows on the outside, but in the way that lives in the chest and behind the eyes. She allowed Rex to put his head in her lap while she sat in the back of the police car, and she kept one hand in his fur, steadying herself against the warmth of him. An officer confirmed within the hour that the van was registered to a logistics company, with a board connection that Sarah's investigation had already flagged. The circle was closing but not yet closed, and Emma understood from the look that passed between the officers that the people behind this were not going to stop simply because they had failed. She looked out the window as the police car moved through the city streets with Rex pressed quietly against her side. She had been frightened, but she had not moved. She recognized that as something. She was still deciding what to call it. The evidence that had been accumulating across 4 weeks of reporting, the fund records, the board membership documents, the financial consultant's testimony, the phone threat transcript, the brake line report, the van registration, the attacker from the car park who had been formally charged and was beginning to show signs of cooperative interest, was submitted jointly by Sarah's legal team and the city prosecutor's office to a senior magistrate on a Monday morning. The prosecutor's contact, who had first spoken with Sarah 3 weeks earlier, had spent the intervening time building a case that had moved, in the language of formal investigations, from preliminary inquiry to actionable. The magistrate reviewed the submission for 4 hours, asked for 2 supplementary documents, and signed the search warrants before the end of the working day. The raid occurred at midnight. 3 teams, coordinated across the hospital's administrative headquarters, the chairman's private office in the financial district, and a secondary location connected to the logistics company. It was not a dramatic raid in the way that fictional ones are. There were no broken doors or shouted commands echoing through marble lobbies. It was methodical, quiet, and thorough. Files were boxed. Hard drives were removed. The chairman was found at his private office by 2 plainclothes officers who presented the warrant with the calm efficiency of people who have done this many times. He was escorted out of the building without handcuffs, a lawyer called immediately, his face controlled and pale in the way that faces are when a carefully maintained reality finally shifts. Sarah was not at the raid. She had been told about it by her prosecutor contact 2 hours before it happened, had agreed to a temporary information hold, and had spent the night at her desk writing the article that would run the following morning. It was the longest piece she had filed in years, 11 pages in draft, cut to 6 for print, and when her editor called at midnight to confirm the warrant had been executed, she finished the final paragraph and read it back to herself once before sending it to the desk. It ran under a headline that was simple and exact. It said everything that needed to be said in 8 words. The press conference was held at the city prosecutor's office at 10 the following morning. Emma sat in the 3rd row with her father on her left and Rex at her feet, a formal dispensation having been arranged with minimal resistance. Sarah stood near the back of the room, notebook closed, just watching. When the prosecutor stepped to the podium and began reading the formal statement, Emma felt her father's hand come to rest on the back of her chair. It was not quite touching her shoulder. It was close enough to feel. She did not pull away from it. Rex looked up at her once, calmly, and then settled his chin back onto his paws. On the podium, the prosecutor confirmed the arrests, the scope of the financial investigation, the referral to the National Health Regulator, and the immediate release of the emergency fund to affected families, a list that had grown in the weeks since Platform 3 from 1 case to 47. Emma absorbed each word quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had been waiting for this. She had not known what it would feel like when it arrived. What she found was that it felt less like triumph and more like the end of something very heavy being set down, not with celebration, but with relief so deep it was almost indistinguishable from exhaustion. Months after the arrests, life moved more steadily. Claire's recovery remained slow but hopeful. The new treatment was working and careful optimism replaced fear. Emma balanced school, hospital visits, and evenings at home with Rex. Her father visited often, patient and respectful, allowing trust to grow naturally. Rex eventually accepted him, resting his chin on his knee one quiet evening, and Emma knew that was enough. One Saturday, Sarah delivered a letter. Rex had been nominated for the Community Hero Award. The ceremony would be held at the Civic Center. Emma read the letter twice and smiled at Rex, remembering the day on Platform 3 when everything changed. At the ceremony, Emma stood beside Rex, who wore a bronze medallion with calm dignity. The hall was full, her father watched proudly, and her mother viewed from her hospital bed. Emma spoke briefly about choices, truth, and courage. She admitted she had once tried to sell Rex, but now understood that some things have no price, because they are worth everything. Applause filled the hall as Rex pressed gently against her side. Stories like Emma's don't travel far on their own. They travel because people like you decide they deserve to be heard. If this story moved you even slightly, sharing it takes 3 seconds and might be the reason someone else, somewhere, finds the courage to hold on to their leash just a little longer. We put everything we have into bringing you stories that actually matter, and the only way we can keep doing that is if you're still here with us. So if you're not subscribed yet, now might be the right time. Hit the bell too, because the next story in this series is one we've been sitting on for weeks, and we genuinely don't want you to miss it.